So I'm going to talk more about where we're going. I'm going to focus in particular on this topic called global synthetic information. This is something that we've really been focused on in the past year. And going forward, the next few years, this is really going to be central to what we're doing. So like Stephen and Keith talked about, we started with Portland, Oregon, and then we did Chicago, and then for a few years now, we've had a complete representation of the entire United States of America, so that's about 330 million people. And then we're moving towards global synthetic information. Right? So the goal is really to build out a complete representation of the population of the entire world. And so this picture just shows you which countries are sort of currently we're in the data gathering stage, and which countries we're in the population construction phase. And what's happened over the past year is that, and past few years, is that we have focused a lot of effort on streamlining the software side of things. So optimizing our algorithms and automating them, and automating the testing and validation and all of that, so that really now the effort is dominated by the data gathering phase. So now we have like a dedicated team of students. This is all they do. They go out and they gather data about different countries. They speak multiple languages. They're brilliant. And they've really become good at this. Because it's a difficult job, because every country reports information in a different way. The same variable will mean different things to different people, right? And so a lot of the work here is in getting all this information synthesized and standardized so that we can run our software on it. And it was fortuitous that we were engaged in this project because when the Ebola outbreak came along, we were very well positioned to be able to respond to it. So it primarily affected 3 countries in Western Africa, so it's just a small part of this picture. But we really devoted a lot of effort into getting that representation right and getting it turned around very quickly so that it could be used as part of the understanding of what was going on, part of the response effort. So what I want to talk about, though, is what does this enable, right? So when we say we have global synthetic information, what does that mean? And what does that mean for us going forward? What kinds of problems can we look at? So often we say synthetic populations, but really it's much more than that. So for one thing, there's demographics, so that's the people. But then we have a lot of information about interactions within the population. So what does this mean? It means that we have information about the activities that people do over the course of a day. We have geographical information about where people may live and where they work and where they can go to school and so forth, and so how they move around during a day. And we have information about, therefore, who comes into contact with whom. So this is information about interactions in the population, right? So that's sort of this picture on the top here. It's showing you, people moving around and therefore coming into contact with each other during the course of their daily activities. But in addition to that, we also have models of infrastructure. So infrastructure like transportation or power or communication, and that's coupled with human behavior. So this was one of the studies that Stephen briefly mentioned about the improvised nuclear device going off in Washington, D.C., where we really put a lot of effort into figuring out the right representations of these infrastructures and how they interact with human behavior, right? Especially in the context of disasters. And we learned a lot during that process. We don't have this level of detail for the entire globe. Just the information isn't available. But this is something that we're heading towards, at least at a smaller scale, while we're building out the global population. Right? So what does having this kind of thing enable? Right? So the main idea is that it allows us to look at global problems as global problems. So the simplest example, or not necessarily a simple example, but this is what we do already. So this is just more of what we do at a global scale now, which is looking at infectious disease pandemics, right? So if you remember, for example, the H1N1 pandemic from 2009, it was called swine flu. It started in Mexico. And then within about 6 months, it had spread throughout the entire world. And 6 months is about the time that it took for people to sort of understand that there was a pandemic going on. So these things happen very, very rapidly, right? So you're never really in a situation where you say, oh yeah, there's a pandemic going on and I can stop it at its source. Really, you're focused on well, it's a pandemic now, it's all over the world, what can we do? How can we coordinate efforts to mitigate the effects, right? And if we only look at some small part of the world, even if it's like the entire United States, you're getting only a very small part of the picture, and therefore your response is very limited. But if you can look at the entire globe, if you can model the entire population of the world, suddenly you have a lot more powerful tool in your hand to be able to address these questions. So, but this is, business as usual. What can we do beyond this, right? So we can look at all kinds of problems that involve interactions between people, that involve policy, that involve society and culture, and environmental effects. Here's one example. This is percentage of males smoking any tobacco product, right? And what has happened in the last 50 years or so is that tobacco use has shifted that way, right? So it used to be that in the US, if you go back to like the 1950s, if you watch Mad Men, right, it's like more than half the population smoked, like all the time, right? And now the numbers are down to like between 15 and 20%. And there's a lot of variation within the US also. But if you look at the Eastern countries, with China and India and Russia, the proportion of the smokers are very, very high. From the perspective of the tobacco companies, the entire world is their market, right? And what has happened in the West now is that we have seen the rise of e-cigarettes, electronic nicotine delivery systems, things like that. And there's a lot that's not understood yet about how harmful they are or not, whether they help you quit smoking or they help you continue smoking. And it's really sort of the Wild West as far as regulation is concerned. We don't really have any regulations in place about who they can be marketed to, who they can be sold to, who can use them indoors or outdoors or where, right? And so it's very helpful to be able to think about so the global scale of this problem and how it interacts with regulations and policy as well as social and cultural norms, in addition to the health aspect of it. Another example is if you look at just the leading causes of death in different countries, right? And what you'll find is that, broadly speaking, you have developing world problems, which have much more to do with infectious diseases, and you have Western world problems, which have more to do with chronic diseases. Right? But that's an oversimplification, because if you really pay attention, you'll find that there is a group of countries that are developing countries but have, so to speak, Western world problems. Right? And so why is that? Right? So it's not such a simple question. So the answer is perhaps that it has to do with a combination of cultural effects, economic effects, and health effects. Right? And so to be able to understand why exactly this is happening and how it's going to evolve in the future, it's important to be able to have a global picture, right? And the final example I'll give, which is probably the most complicated one, is if you start looking at climate change effects, they will be different in different parts of the world, right? So you have rising sea levels and damage to coral reefs in some places. You have reduced crop yields in some places, but you have better farming conditions in other places. You have more unpredictable monsoons in India, and you have increased risk of malaria in Africa. So this is really a creeping change. We know it's coming, and in order to understand what we have to do, we have to understand how it will affect different parts of the world differently, right? So this is sort of a grand challenge problem. If you really want to understand how the world is going to look in 50 years, this is what you have to work with, right? And so this is sort of the direction we're going in with being able to represent the population and interactions the world over. And I think that's it. Okay, thank you.